presenter.
Okay, thank you very much for being here today. We are very honored to have an historian that lives in our area here to be part of this museum. This is not the first lecture he did for us. He does many for us. And he does it sometimes on a spur of the moment I need him. But anyway, Frank Hawkins is a great advocate of the military, and he came up with this idea that, you know, go right ahead. He came up with the idea, he said, you know, because everybody talks about the Battle of the Bulge, everybody talks about Pearl Harbor, everybody talks about D-Day, you know. He said, let's talk about the Russian front, because that was made very, very significant for us. Unfortunately, we're fighting one tyrant, and then we have another tyrant that's helping us. I mean, because let's face it, Stalin was not what you call a nice guy. Okay. So anyway, Frank's going to go into all the details of this, and I'd like to give him a nice round of applause for being here today.
Thanks, Emmett. I cannot be prouder of what Emmett has achieved here, along with so many of you who are actively involved with him and have helped him so much. This is a remarkable place, and it is a very important place, part of this community, and for all of you who've helped him and been part of this, I personally thank you very much. I'm going to start this little discussion today with a warning label. It is impossible to give a talk like this without lots of numbers. And some of these numbers you will hear today are not just staggering. They're in fact beyond comprehension. I fear your heads are going to go absolutely numb when you hear these numbers, but frankly, there's no choice if the story's going to be told. So I'll try and keep them to a minimum if I can. I recently won a contest in World War II magazine, and the prize was a 15-disc set of lectures given by the famous author Stephen Ambrose. And what was interesting about that was that not a single one of those lectures was about the Eastern Front. And so it's interesting, Americans, as Emmett was just sort of suggesting a moment ago, that Americans who are interested in World War II, generally familiar with D-Day and Battle of the Bulge and Pearl Harbor, and along with the key players, you know, Erwin Rommel and Churchill and Montgomery and Patton, of course, Winston Churchill and Ike. Most Americans believe that D-Day was the turning point of the war. In fact, there was one book actually written that was entitled D-Day, 24 Hours That Saved the World. Now I'm, I guess, what you would call an advanced D-Day buff. I have toured and studied the battlefields on Normandy 4 different times, including one time where I spent 5 days with my grandsons with a historian. So I'm knowledgeable about Omaha Beach at a forensic level. So I certainly don't mean to disparage in any way what happened there. But what you all need to know, and while you're here today, is to hear that in fact there is a huge, much larger story about what happened in Europe in World War II. Namely, the struggle between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. This is where the largest and deadliest battles of the war were fought, with horrendous consequences for both sides. In fact, get this, 6 of the top 10 bloodiest battles of World War II, including the top 4, were fought on the Russian front. And get this, D-Day didn't even make the list. In fact, without the stunning, tragic Russian effort, I believe D-Day would not have been possible. The Nazis might still be in control of Western Europe. Now, the conflict was between two thoroughly brutal regimes. Long before the German invasion, Stalin had created the greatest edifice of mass murder and human suffering in the history of the world. Now, Hitler's crimes, as he was coming to power, are generally well known among folks like us who are interested in it. But you may not know that Stalin's policies, before the war even started, caused the deaths of between 10 and 20 million Soviet citizens. And there was another purge after the war that was almost as bad. And by the way, just as kind of an aside note, this is part of Russia most Americans don't understand or comprehend. And the fact is that Vladimir Putin is arguably the most enlightened and best leader that Russia has ever had. But that's a story for another time. World War II began on September 1st, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland. Only 9 days earlier, on 23 August, Hitler and Stalin had signed a mutual non-aggression pact, basically outlining spheres of influence and agreeing that they would divide up Poland. Within days of the Polish invasion, somewhat to the surprise of Hitler, frankly, the British and French actually managed to live up to the terms of their commitments, and they declared war on Germany. The Allies this time had not folded as they had in the past when Hitler had marched into the Sudetenland and had marched into Czechoslovakia and had annexed Austria. After a few relatively quiet months, the so-called phony war ended. Hitler invaded Denmark and Norway in April, and after 19 delays, because of weather and other factors, Hitler ordered his panzers into France and the Low Countries. And by mid-1940, he controlled a major portion of Western Europe. He briefly considered an invasion of England, but the German Luftwaffe losses during the Battle of Britain were so serious that Hitler backed off because he realized there was no way he could cross the channel without air cover. And so, what did he do? He turned his attention to Russia. Operation Barbarossa was the code name for the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union. Launched on Sunday, 22nd of June in 1941, and here's the most interesting part. It caught Stalin and the Russians almost totally by surprise. It was the largest military operation in history. More men, tanks, guns, aircraft were committed than had ever been deployed in a single offensive. In preparation for the attack, Hitler had secretly moved upwards of 3 million troops up to the Russian border. And the entire Axis forces were deployed across a front extending from the Arctic downward all the way to the Black Sea. So there were 4 army groups. It was Norway, North, Center, and South. Interestingly, Stalin had actually received some intelligence reports that Hitler was planning something, but he could not bring himself to believe that Hitler would actually do it. So in the first few months of summer and early fall, Hitler's panzers tore through Russia. But as the months went on, the generals began to have a nervous feeling. They began to realize that maybe they had taken on just a little bit more than they had thought they were going to get. Because you see, as the Germans moved forward, the Russian peasants fled. They burned their own harvested crops. They drove the cattle away. They even destroyed buildings in their villages. This was part of what they call the scorched earth policy. designed to deny the Nazis any sort of supplies or foodstuffs. Now, roughly 3 months after the invasion, Hitler's Army Group Center reached the outskirts of Moscow. Soviets at that point, this is really amazing, try and remember this number. The Soviets at that point had only 90,000 men and 150 tanks left to defend the city. The Germans, in fact, predicted the imminent capture of the city, and they convinced the foreign correspondents of a pending Soviet collapse. The 3rd Panzer Group got within 87 miles of the capital. Martial law was declared in Moscow. But as it turned out, the first big setback for Hitler took place then. You see, Stalin had one enormous ally that the Germans had not properly planned for. It was the same ally that had defeated Napoleon 129 years earlier, the weather. Autumn had turned unpaved roads into mud and slowed the advance. Early snows had followed by more rain, creating a glutinous mud that the German tanks had trouble moving around in. As it turned out, the Russian T-34 tank had a wider tread than the German tanks, and was better suited for the muddy conditions. At the same time, the German supply situation rapidly deteriorated. This created a muddy pause, gave the Soviets time to consolidate their positions and to call in reserves from the Far East. On December 2nd, part of Hitler's 258th Infantry Division advanced to within 15 miles of Moscow. They were so close that the German officers could see the spires of the Kremlin. One reconnaissance battalion actually reached the town of Khimki, which is only about 5 miles from Moscow, and captured the bridge over the Moscow-Volga Canal, as well as a railway station. This turned out to be the easternmost advance of the German forces. The first of the winter blizzards had begun. Deep snow hindered the German equipment and mobility, and the summer uniforms did not keep the men from the freezing conditions. Bad weather grounded the Luftwaffe, and the newly created Soviet units near Moscow grew to almost 500,000 men, up from 90,000. So you can see how fast the Russians were bringing up the reserves from the east. On December 5th, the Russians launched a massive counterattack and pushed the German armies back between 60 and 120 miles beyond Moscow. At that point, the Wehrmacht had lost the battle for Moscow. The fierce and well-executed Russian resistance and a terrible winter with temperatures down as far as 22 -0, below 0 Fahrenheit and colder. The Germans were never able to take Moscow. Losses were enormous. Soviets suffered more than 650,000 casualties in 20 days. The Germans lost between 250 and 400,000 men that they could not afford to lose. It was a major setback. So already in early 1942, the tide of the war had begun to turn a little bit. But there was still a lot of bloodshed to come. And by the way, some of you may know this, Napoleon actually managed to capture Moscow and was able to spend a month there before, a month in 1812, but that was not enough to defeat ultimately the Russians or the Russian winter. The 29-month siege of Leningrad began in September 1941 and lasted 2.5 years. There were 1.5 million casualties, including 800,000 Russian civilians, roughly the population of Charlotte. It was a prolonged military blockade from the south against Leningrad, historically and currently known as St. Petersburg. And by the way, has anybody here ever been to St. Petersburg? Yeah, you know what an amazing place it is, and going through the Hermitage is just astonishing experience all by itself. Well, the capture of the city had been one of three strategic goals of Operation Barbarossa, and it was the main target of Army Group North. The strategy was motivated by Leningrad's political status as both the former capital of Russia and the political capital of the symbolic capital of the Russian Revolution. It's where the revolution started. It was also a main base for the Soviet Baltic Fleet, and it housed a lot of armament factories. In fact, I think around 11% of all Russian industrial strength was at that point in Leningrad. It was reported that Hitler, who was allied at that point with the Finnish against the Russians, was so confident that he was going to capture Leningrad that he actually had invitations printed for the victory celebration that he was going to host in the city's Astoria Hotel. Now, the siege started on 8th of September 1941, when the last road in was cut. And although the Soviet forces managed to open a narrow corridor to the city in January of 1943, the siege was not lifted until a year later, 872 days after it began. The city was under siege by both the German and the Finnish troops, who were allied with the Germans for most of the war. The 2.5-year siege caused the greatest destruction and largest loss of life ever known in a modern city. On Hitler's direct orders, the Wehrmacht looted and then destroyed a number of the imperial palaces, such as the Catherine Palace and the Peterhof Palace, as well as other historic landmarks located around the city, and many art collections which the Germans scooped up and took back. Factories, schools, hospitals, other civilian infrastructure destroyed by air raids and long-range artillery bombardments. The 2.5-year siege caused famine through disruption of all their infrastructure and utilities and everything, resulting in the deaths of 1.5 million soldiers and civilians. There were another 1.4 million civilians who managed to be evacuated, mainly women, children, and older people. And a lot of those people died during the evacuation, during the starvation and bombardment. The Memorial Cemetery in Leningrad holds roughly half of the 1 million civilian victims of the siege. Economic and human destruction and human losses on both sides were more than the Battle of Stalingrad or the Battle of Moscow or the bombing of Tokyo. It was the longest and most destructive sieges in history, and possibly the costliest in terms of casualties. The Second Battle of Kharkov was Germany's biggest single victory on the Eastern Front. There were 300,000 casualties, and by comparison, there were 33,000 total casualties on D-Day, just to give you a sense of perspective. And Kharkov was an important city in the Ukraine. It had seen fierce fighting in the autumn of 1941 when the Germans originally captured the city. In 1942, the Russians launched a major offensive to retake the city, and that's this battle. The Germans were able to encircle 3 Soviet armies and destroy them. They wiped out nearly 280,000 Russian men and destroyed 650 tanks. It was a disaster for the Soviets. But more importantly, it inflated the Germans' confidence at a time when they needed it. The Battle of Stalingrad was the real turning point of the war. It was the largest confrontation of World War II. It was a battle for control of a city now known as Volgograd in southern Russia. It involved nearly 2.2 million personnel, the largest and bloodiest battle in the history of warfare. The German offensive to capture Stalingrad began in August, supported by heavy bombing from the Luftwaffe, and which reduced the city to rubble. And that resulted in a lot of bitter house-to-house fighting. And by mid-November, the Germans had pushed the Soviet defenders onto some narrow bits of territory along the Volga River. And by the way, one of the best and most gripping movies ever made about World War II. It's called Enemy at the Gates. Some of you may remember it came out in 2001. It's a story of German and Russian snipers playing cat and mouse. It's a remarkable film, and it gives you a sense of the misery involved in that battle. On the 19th of November, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a two-pronged attack targeting the weaker Romanian and Hungarian armies that were protecting the flanks of the 6th Army, and they were overrun. The 6th Army was cut off and surrounded, and in one of the most disastrous decisions of any war ever, Hitler ordered the army to stay in place, to stay in Stalingrad, and make no attempt to break out. The plan was the Germans were going to resupply the army and try and break through the encirclement from outside. Heavy fighting went on for another 2 months, and by the beginning of February of 1943, the Germans were out of ammunition and out of food. Finally, the remaining units of the 6th Army, they were headed up by the newly promoted Field Marshal von Paulus, surrendered. 265,000 men surrendered. The Germans never recovered from this most destructive of battles, one of the bloodiest of all times. And after this, the German High Command, and this is very important, the German High Command at that point then was forced to pull troops back from the Western Front in France to make up for some of their losses in Russia. And of course, ultimately, that sort of thing helped make D-Day possible. In his memoir, Hans Bauer, who was Hitler's personal pilot and his confidant and friend, said, quote, "The tragedy of Stalingrad was the beginning of the end for Germany. Not only did Hitler lose a great army, but in addition, the confidence which up until that time had reigned supreme at home was destroyed." The Battle of Kursk, July and August of 1943, resulted in over 1 million casualties. I mean, these numbers are just, you can barely comprehend them. This was the final strategic offensive launched by the Germans on the Eastern Front. It was the largest series of armored tank clashes in the entire war and included the costliest single day of aerial conflict in history. For the first time, each side relied on masses of aircraft, specially designed or equipped to destroy tanks. And both the Germans and the Soviet attacked aircraft through combat missions with some amount of ground control. Liaison officers were attached to the armored forces, and through a vast and brilliantly constructed network of minefields and anti-tank guns and defenses 155 miles deep, the Soviets wore down their attackers and then launched counterstrikes. The Germans reported losing 194 aircraft and 500 tanks. The Soviets acknowledged losing 1,100 aircraft and upwards of 1,500 tanks. The Germans suffered 200,000 casualties, the Soviets 860,000 casualties in this battle. Although the Russian losses were much greater than the Germans at that point in the war could not afford losses of this magnitude. And the battle gave the Soviet Red Army a strategic initiative that was never lost for the remainder of the war. You've never heard of this. You've probably never even heard of this town. The 6-month-long Battle of Narva. Narva is a city on the Baltic in Estonia, just east of Tallinn. It was a scene of ferocious fighting with over 500,000 casualties. Both sides were desperate to hold on to this valuable piece of land, and the fighting was among the most intense of the war, actually. Finally, after months of terrible combat, it left hundreds of thousands dead, particularly on the side of the Soviets. Hitler finally, because of what was going on at that point in France, Hitler evacuated all the troops from Estonia. Now note the date. He moves out August 10, what had happened in June of 1944. The Allies had come ashore in Normandy. So already now these two forces began to have some noticeable relationship. By early spring of 1945, the Soviets had reclaimed most of their territory that had been captured by the Germans. The end of the war was clearly in sight, but it wasn't over yet. Zelo was less than 60 miles east of Berlin. The Battle of the Zelo Heights was one of the last assaults on large entrenched defensive positions of the World War II. It was fought over 3 days in mid-April. Close to 1 million Soviet soldiers of the First Belarusian Front, commanded by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, attacked the position known as the Gates to Berlin. They were opposed at this point by a mere 110,000 German soldiers of the 9th Army, mainly old men at this point, kids, some veterans. Fighting was bitter, but at that point the Germans were desperately fighting, not only for their lives, now they were fighting for their homeland. Actually, the Zelo sector was one of several crossing points along the Oder and Neisse rivers where the Soviets attacked the opening phase of the Battle of Berlin. Estimates of Soviet casualties during the assault on the Zelo Heights vary from 10,000 to 30,000 killed. But when it all ended, the Russians were only 56 miles from Berlin and had a straight shot directly in. And by the way, earlier this year, I was in Zelo. There's a remarkable museum there dedicated about that battle, and it's filled with good, interesting uniforms and weapons and photos, and it was a really interesting visit. The Battle of Berlin was the last major offensive of the war in Europe, and resulted in the final collapse of the German army and, of course, the death of Hitler. The Red Army attacked the city from the east and the south, and another group attacked from the north. The relentless Soviet army marched ever onwards, causing widespread panic in the already deleted German defenses, at that point really manned by old men and kids, teenagers. Following fierce and bloody fighting, the Russians took the Reichstag Parliament building on the 30th of April, more or less signaling the end of combat in Europe. Hitler had been the leader of the Nazi Germany since 1933. He had triggered the bloodiest and costliest war of all humankind. On April 30th, it all came to an end. He killed himself with a pistol shot to the head in the Führer bunker in Berlin, just as the Russians were storming the Reichstag's Parliament building only 1,300 yards away. Eva Braun, his long-term mistress and his wife of one day, was beside him on the couch as he shot himself, and she bit down on a cyanide pill and killed herself. In accordance with Hitler's instructions, their remains were carried up the steps through the bunker's emergency exit, doused in gasoline, and burned in the garden just outside the bunker entrance, and then covered over lightly with some dirt. Their badly charred remains were not discovered by the Russians until 4 days later by a Russian private named Ivan Churakov, who was doing some poking around outside of the bunker. And the remains actually weren't provisionally identified until the next day. In fact, there was actually a silent inter-service rivalry within the Russian army about who was going to control those remains. Now, it's very interesting that Stalin deliberately kept his knowledge of the death of Hitler from both Truman and from Churchill. But that's a story for another time. Ultimately, Hitler's remains were interred in successive locations until 1970, when they were again exhumed and cremated again, and the ashes scattered around by the Soviets. Now, a number of books have been written about the Battle for Berlin and the death of Hitler, including several by those who were actually in the bunker with him when he killed himself. I've read most of them, but none, I guarantee you, none is more compelling than this book, Memoirs of a Wartime Interpreter, covering the war from the battle for Moscow to Hitler's bunker. As a translator for the Russian Army intelligence, Elena Revskaya had a unique perspective on the war. Her book provides, as far as I know, the only true account of the discovery of Hitler's body and what happened to it. The book is one of the most compelling books about the war I've read. As an interpreter for the GRU, at one point, are you ready for this? She was actually carrying Hitler's teeth around in a box. But that's a story for another day. Joseph Stalin had a memorable quote that is relevant here. "One death is a tragedy. 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic." The struggle on the Eastern Front resulted in clashes of unprecedented violence and destruction. In 4 years, more than 26 million Soviet military and civilians were killed. In the course of the war, nearly 30 million Soviet citizens were drafted for service of one kind or another. As many as 9 million people in Germany died. By comparison, the U.S. suffered 417,000 military deaths, and that's both Europe and Asia, another 617,000 wounded, and about 1,300 civilian deaths. A total of 16 million Americans served in uniform during the war in both Europe and the Pacific. More people died fighting on the Eastern Front than all the fighting across the globe during World War II. Damage to the Russian economy and the landscape was just enormous. An estimated 1,700 towns and 70,000 villages were burned out or leveled. During the struggle, the Germans captured 5 million Red Army troops, a majority of whom never returned alive. The Nazis deliberately starved to death or otherwise killed 3.3 million prisoners, as well as a large number of civilians through what they called the Hunger Plan, that aimed largely at replacing the Slavic population with German settlers. Death squads and gassing operations murdered over 1 million Soviet Jews as part of the Holocaust. In retrospect, Operation Barbarossa was the most colossal strategic error in the history of warfare. For Hitler, it meant his 1,000-year Reich, Third Reich, lasted only 12 years. For ordinary Germans, the outcome was economically, emotionally, and physically shattering. Entire cities were left in ruin at the end of the war. Barely any German family had not suffered losses. The defeat of the Germans in Operation Barbarossa changed the political landscape of Europe, dividing it into Eastern and Western blocs. The political vacuum that was left in the eastern half of the continent was filled by the Soviets. Stalin's Red Army occupied Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the eastern half of Germany. Stalin had a deep fear of any resurgence of German power, and his paranoia included distrust of the Allied powers. He knew Churchill did not like him or trust him. Operation Barbarossa affected not only Stalin, but colored the strategic mindset of Soviet leaders for the next 40 years. And to some degree, it's never gone away. Eastern Europe remained under communist control for 44 years until 1989. Western Europe was the democratic sway of the United States, what came to be known as the Cold War. And that's where I came in, but more about that some other time. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
I was in Germany during when the wall went up.
1961, August 1961.
Yeah, I was there 2 years, and I moved around quite a bit from base to base, but I worked with a number of German veterans, because the military would hire these guys, and they were all guys, I guess. And they worked in various capacities. They worked in the library, or they worked in the motor pool, or they worked here and there. And I had a chance to speak with them, and I made a point of doing that. And virtually to a man, they all said that they served on the Western Front. I couldn't find any of them who served on the Eastern.
There weren't many survived it.
Well, that's a good point. But, that's another point. But the other thing that I found striking, I've since traveled in Eastern Europe some, and I talked to people about this because of course, is a fascinating subject. But their take on the war is different from ours, and your figures substantiate what they said. They believe the Soviet Army won the war. That
You can make a pretty good case for that.
That the Americans were really a junior partner. Now, they will go on and then say, yeah, but the main contribution the Americans made was materiel and spam.
Trucks.
And without the spam,
Yep.
it would probably been a lost cause. But they do believe, and this kind of runs counter to standard textbooks in the schools here, that it was the Soviets who won the war.
I mean, it was a combined effort, but truly, you can see from this that the Soviet impact was overwhelming. I mean, as I said earlier in the discussion, I don't think that if the Soviets had collapsed, the Germans would have won the war. We never would have had D-Day. Yes, sir.
Could you talk a little bit about the convoys that went around the top of Norway and provided supplies to the Russians?
I'm not a big expert on that. I know that that's what happened, that was the supply line. They also, I think there might have been some supplies that went into Vladivostok, but I think that convoy over the top of Norway. But of course, remember, Germans at that point occupied Norway. Yes, sir.
What if Hitler started the invasion earlier?
Well, you know what? I didn't bring that up, but that is an issue.
Why was it delayed?
That's right. Well, the delays all almost certainly had to do with the generals telling him they were ready to go. And of course, that was part of the delay in May 1940 when they finally rolled into France after 19 delays. And Hitler had given the order to go, and they said, no, we can't do it because of this and that, the weather. You make a very interesting case. If they had gone a month earlier, in May, they might have gotten to Moscow. I mean, that was the first big initial surge. You could talk about that for a long time, but it's a very good point and a valid one.
One of the best books out was The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer.
Absolutely.
I had my kids read that when I was teaching history.
Getting back to what this gentleman was saying a minute ago about what happened after the war, Bill O'Reilly has just written a book, which I just finished reading, by the way, called Killing the SS. And one of the most interesting insights that he has in that book is the number of Nazis who and German military personnel who survived the war and ended up back in the new German government that started in 1948. That's a subject for certainly another day, but it is interesting to think about that. And at the end of the day, I guess the only thing you can think is, well, what was the final result? Yes, sir.
Two questions. The comment about the Polish officers that were assassinated in block, and then the other question is a side story. What's ever happened to the amber that came from the golden ring?
Well, if I knew, I wouldn't be standing here, I tell you that. It's one of the great mysteries of World War II. What happened, most recently, in the last 2 years or so, there was this story that was buried in a train in Poland somewhere, and the guys were looking for it. Nobody knows. I mean, it's one of the great mysteries of the war. Fascinating. People are still talking about it and thinking about it, and who knows? It's hard to speculate.
Okay, yeah. I was in Livorno, and I ran into a guy, and his name was Rudy Mucho. He ran a restaurant just outside Camp Darby at the time. He told me this story. I'll make it go short. He was a German submariner, and he said at the end of the war, he said the captain locked them all in their quarters, and sub, and they went to a secret place, and he said certain people offloaded boxes. This may be where the gold is, or a portion of the gold. How true the story is, I have no idea, Frank.
Well, you triggered a personal story for me. After I got to Germany with the 513th MI group, I looked up a girl who had been an exchange student in our high school. I was in Bremerhaven, and turned out that she lived in Bremen, which is about an hour's drive from Bremerhaven. And so she and I got together and spent some time together. And one day I can still remember going to her house and went in the foyer. And there in the foyer was an autographed, signed picture from Admiral Uranus. And you know, I was just so young and I wasn't investigative enough to think about it, but almost certainly her father must have been in the German Navy and must have had some relationship with Uranus. And to this day, I am so sorry I did not pursue that, but you're young, what the hell do you know? Yes, sir.
Two what-if questions. One, suppose instead of attacking us, the Japanese had attacked Russia. And the other one is, if Hitler, instead of being brutal after he conquered, he tried to recruit the Russians to his side, that could there have been enough initial hostility towards Stalin to have effectively made a difference there?
I don't know, it's interesting. Stalin killed off almost the entire leadership of the Red Army prior to the war. He was so afraid of them. And I mean, it devastated them. They were not ready for that war. And what makes the whole, to me at least, what makes the whole Soviet thing so interesting is that they were able to get together and go again. And of course, it was totally brutal. When you hear stories from the Eastern Front of the Russians, where they were attacking the Germans, they would send in people who did not have any rifles and say, you just rush on up, and then, you know, somebody got killed and you pick up that guy's rifle and you move on forward. And by the way, if you turn around, we have a machine gun here and we're going to kill you. There are lots of stories like that. So, you know, the what if stuff is interesting, always fun to talk about over cocktails, and I'm not very good at it. Yes, sir?
How close did the Nazis come to developing the atomic bomb?
I don't think they got real close. You know, they had that that heavy water operation going on in Norway, and recently one of the guys who was involved in that died. Yeah, that's right. So I read a lot about it. They were talking about it. They were interested in it, but they were not that far along, even with the heavy water. Because at that point, by the time they get into 43, 44, their resources were dwindling in a hurry. Speer was doing everything he could just to keep the war going. And, you know, it is interesting to talk about that, though, because they did do some remarkable things. They put up the Me-262s, first jet fighters used in combat, and those planes were fast enough to actually knock down our B-17s and B-24s. So the ability of the Germans to build to use technology to build weapons is just remarkable. And it's interesting to think about it, for sure.
Well, Werner von Braun
Yeah.
proved that.
Well, that's right, exactly. Oh, by the way, it's interesting to note on that, there were several sets of those rocket guys out of Peenemünde. And we got Werner von Braun and his crowd. There was another group that went to Egypt. I don't know if you all know this story or not. Another group that went to Egypt, and they were going to help the Egyptians build rockets that could be fired into Israel. And one of the, I don't know if you all know who Skorzeny was. Skorzeny was a general who worked for Hitler, who was the guy who rescued Mussolini. And he was basically a big-time commando. After the war, the Israelis hired him to knock off those German scientists who were working for the Egyptians. It's a hell of a story. Yes, sir.
What was the name of that book again, the memoirs?
Go back and you can write it down. Hang on a second. Memoirs of a Wartime Interpreter. And you can get it on Amazon, and you know, they'll send it to you in a day or two. I guarantee you will not be able to put it down. It's just fascinating. It's a unique look at what happened there. Yeah, Janice?
When Hitler and Stalin signed the non-aggression pact, are you surprised that Stalin believed that Hitler would honor it?
Well, you know, it's sort of like honor among thieves. You know, sort of that mindset. He just couldn't believe that Hitler would violate it.
It seems like I read that Stalin and Hitler agreed that Hitler could invade Europe and Stalin was going to invade Finland. Is that right?
Yeah, that was probably would have been right. I mean, they agreed to divide up Poland.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I was going to expound on that just a little bit. I had a course class with Khrushchev's son, who's a professor at Brown University in
Wow.
Providence. But I sat down and specifically asked him about why Stalin was so reluctant to believe the intelligence reports and the movements of big movements of troops and tanks and aircraft and all the equipment. And part of it was because of the purge, which you talked about, of the Red Army leadership, and the fact that Stalin was buying Stalin for time, wanting to stave off any kind of confrontation with Hitler and the Nazis for as long as he could in order to build up his forces and his leadership as well. So there was plenty of evidence there that something was going on, which you talked about.
That's right.
But when I asked Dr. Khrushchev about it, it was he had created so much damage to his own forces and leadership of the military of the Red Army that he had to find a way to stall for time so they could build it up too.
That's good insight.
Mike?
Further comment about the viciousness of Stalin. Janice and I have just come back from a study tour of Poland, and the resistance fighters in Warsaw, when they heard the Red Army was only 4 or 5 days away, they decided, well, if we rise up and start fighting the Germans, we'll help the war effort and help, bring the war quick. And so they had an emissary that talked to Stalin and said, if we do this, will you advance into Poland and help and unite with us and help? And Stalin said, oh yes, I will do that. And so the resistance fighters started the Warsaw Uprising, and then the Russian army was right on the other side of the river. They could see them. And Stalin ordered them to stop because he knew that those resistance fighters would be the ones that would give him trouble after the war. So he wanted the Germans to do his dirty work for him and kill them all, which they did. And even as the Western allies from England said, well, we could fly over and drop supplies to the resistance fighters in Warsaw, but we would need to land on the Russian side on the airfields to refuel and go back. And Stalin said, no, you may not land and refuel.
Interesting insight. I want to hear more about your trip. I had some insight from Janice, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about it. It sounded like a fascinating trip. It's a trip I plan to take in some version in the near future. Listen, thank you very much.
Those numbers are just